he just kind of point out the hypocrisy, the double standards, and the imperialism of Canadian policy dealing with really three countries, maybe four, but basically honing in on Venezuela and contrasting that to their policy on Haiti, Honduras, and a little bit of Cuba. So this story and all the dominant media kind of coverage of Chrystia Freeland talks about her standing up for the rules-based international order. She's supposedly a crusader for, and that's how they, frame this campaign that Canada is waging against open campaign to overthrow Venezuela's government. Right? It's openly being. There's no pretense. Right? They're literally organizing meetings where they're talking about how can we work to overthrow this government in Venezuela. And so Chrystia Freeland and the Canadian government has been right at the forefront of this campaign in Venezuela of open effort to overthrow the Nicolas Maduro government. Before, there are legitimate criticisms of the Nicolas Maduro government. There are even, I would say, some question marks about the electoral credentials of the Venezuelan government. But the democratic legitimacy of the Venezuelan government is infinitely greater than the opposition in Venezuela that we're supporting. So while there are some question marks on some, even on the question of democratic legitimacy, there wasn't for 2 decades, but in more recent times, I think you could say there are some question marks. The Venezuelan government has a great deal of, Maduro has a great deal of legitimate argument in saying that these are responses to the opposition's efforts. It's just sabotage. But so the Canadian government has been right at the forefront of trying to oust the Venezuelan government, organized this Lima group where they brought together countries after they were unsuccessful of sanctioning Venezuela via the Organization of American States, condemning Venezuela via the Organization of American States. They created this Lima group of opposition countries to push for the overthrow of the Maduro government. The Canadian government has repeatedly attacked the Venezuelan government for its human rights violations, even brought the Venezuelan government to the International Criminal Court. The only time another member state of the ICC has brought another member to the ICC. So of all the human rights violations taking place in the world, we are to believe that the Venezuelan governments are the worst that the Canadian government can imagine. 4 rounds of illegal sanctions by Canada against Venezuela, trying to do everything they can to deter business between Canada and Venezuela, holding assets of Venezuelan officials in Canada. Now, again, the rhetoric in the Globe and Mail and what you hear about Chrystia Freeland is that we're standing up for the international rules-based order. But if you take a look at the UN Charter, the Organization of American States Charter, you'll find that unilateral sanctions violate those charters. That level of intervention violates those charters. Never will a Globe and Mail profile of Chrystia Freeland bother to look into that question. At least they can have conflicting sides of legal assessments of how sanctions are understood under international law. That won't even appear. The Canadian government has been supporting opposition forces within Venezuela, civil society, NGO opposition groups, supporting those different groups. As the outgoing Canadian ambassador, Ben Roswell, put it to the Ottawa Citizen about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I guess now, he said, quote, "We became one of the most vocal embassies in speaking out on human rights issues and encouraging Venezuelans to speak out." So, this is, of course, one-sided, right? This is opposition speaking out against government human rights violations, not speaking out when the opposition forces are responsible for all kinds of deaths in protests. That's not what they talk about, but not what they're referring to when they talk about encouraging Venezuelans to speak out. So Canada's been supporting opposition forces. In January, when the head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, declared himself the president of the country, Canada, according to Associated Press, quote, played a key role in building the international diplomatic support for that effort. The Globe and Mail reported previously that Friedland spoke with Guaido to congratulate him on unifying opposition forces in Venezuela 2 weeks before he declared himself interim president. So basically, Canada was involved in the process of bringing Venezuelan groups and international and other countries behind this plan of the head of the National Assembly, which is run by the opposition, declaring himself the legitimate president of Venezuela. And the Canadian government pressed other countries to get behind this plan of the opposition to try to claim legitimacy. So the Canadian government, Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, called numerous countries, heads of state all around the world, saying, join us in this campaign to recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And they've done that, and they've been doing that for even before Guaido self-declared as president. They've been pressuring countries, particularly in the Caribbean, where Canada has a lot of power, to get on board with the anti-Maduro program at the Organization of American States and more generally. And with regards to Cuba specifically, the Canadian government, which is of course a strong ally of Venezuela, Chrystia Freeland has really pressed Cuba to weaken its ties to Venezuela. She's made multiple trips to the country. After one of those, she told reporters that, quote, Cuba needs to not be part of the problem in Venezuela, but become part of the solution. And so when the Americans brought in more aggressive sanctions on Cuba and legislation allowing for Americans to sue those who had property taken from after the Cuban Revolution, which there are many Canadian companies operating in Cuba that potentially their operations could find the Americans could be making claims in U.S. court against their operations in Cuba, something that of course threatens, the Canadian, some mining companies operating there, tourism companies. Chrystia Freeland has taken a very minimalistic kind of defense of Canadian corporate interests in Cuba in light of changes allowing for Americans to go after, potentially go after some of those assets. And the Canadian government went one step further and actually cut off or ended visa processing in Cuba, forcing Cubans that want to come to Canada to have to go get their visas processed in another country. So effectively having to travel to Mexico to get a visa to come to Canada, of course making it very impractical for most Cubans to come to Canada. So the Canadian government has been just heavily involved in this campaign against the Cuban government and has been willing to go to quite impressive diplomatic lengths, pressuring countries all around the world to join this campaign. And this is all happening, quite open, right? This is something. The Globe and Mail in their profile of Chrystia Freeland portrays this as some sort of Canada working for world peace or benevolent exercise. The most recent phase of this campaign, with Juan Guaido being the self-declared president of Venezuela, is being done under the guise of upholding the Venezuelan constitution. Okay, and this is so much to the point where at one town hall where someone yelled to Justin Trudeau, "Hands off Venezuela," Justin Trudeau actually did he responded by explaining the Venezuelan constitution that allowed for the recognition of Juan Guaido as the president, Article 233 of the Venezuelan constitution. And you can watch this video of Justin Trudeau like explaining the Venezuelan constitution, which of course he has no idea about whatsoever. But he's giving this entirely erroneous reading of the Venezuelan constitution, of course. But he's citing the Venezuelan constitution as why we're doing this campaign in Venezuela to get rid of the Maduro presidency. Now, as part of our Lima group of countries opposed to the Venezuelan government that Canada and Peru set up a little over 2 years ago, one of the members of that Lima group is the government of Honduras. Okay, the government of Honduras is led by Juan Orlando Hernandez, who explicitly defied the Honduran constitution to run for a second term as president. Okay, the Honduran constitution is quite clear, but he got a Supreme Court appointed by his party to change the reading of the Honduran constitution. And people may know that back in 2009, there was a military coup against Manuel Zelaya, and the claim for why it was just the military coup was justified was because Manuel Zelaya was having this referendum to open up, potentially have make changes to the Honduran constitution. And so how the media tried to spin that was that he was changing the constitution to allow to run for a second term. So 10 years ago, that was the justification for ousting the social democratic president in Honduras. And now, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president of Honduras, defies the constitution to run for a second, to run in the second election, run for a second term. Now, after about 60% of the votes are counted, he's losing by 5 points. All of a sudden, the election counting goes off for 36 hours. Lo and behold, when it comes back on, he's now in the lead, and he wins the election by a very small margin. So he defies the constitution to run again, and then stuffs the ballots to put himself in there. That's one of our allies in this Lima group trying to force Venezuela to follow our interpretation of their constitution. And you'll see that the Canadian government's response to Juan Orlando Hernandez's election was to immediately recognize, despite this totally fraudulent election, to immediately recognize his presidency. Global Affairs Canada tweeted, "Canada acknowledges confirmation of Juan Orlando Hernandez as president of Honduras. This is amidst massive demonstrations that led to about 30 plus people being killed, 1,000 or more detained. From what I can tell, there's been no reduction of Canadian aid to Honduras. Canadian diplomats repeatedly meet with Honduran officials. Foreign minister comes to the Lima Group meeting that the Trudeau government held in Ottawa in February to discuss Venezuela. Repeated meetings. The foreign minister comes to another conference held in Ottawa. The Canadian diplomats in Central America refer to the bonds of friendship between the government of Canada and Honduras, the excellent relations that exist between both countries, etc., etc. Now, Juan Orlando Hernandez's rise to power flows out of the 2009 coup d'etat that I mentioned earlier against Manuel Zelaya, who was a modest reformist president who had done a few things like increasing the minimum wage, had joined the Bolivarian alliance with Venezuela to improve some trade relations and political relations with Venezuela, Cuba, and some other left-wing countries in the hemisphere. And he was overthrown by the Honduran military, and the Harbour government at the time very much worked in favor of that coup. Eventually, they officially said they weren't supporting the coup, but they didn't cut off the training between the Canadian military and the Honduran military. They didn't end any Canadian aid to Honduras. Even the Americans announced that they were going to cut off some aid. They didn't, in fact, do it. World Bank, European Union, Canada didn't even announce anything. all kinds of diplomatic comments that effectively supported the coup, and then recognized the post-coup government, and that's where one Orlando Hernandez comes out of the right wing gaining after the coup. So when you contrast Canada's policy towards Venezuela and Honduras, you start asking yourself some questions about what the Globe and Mail is referring to about Chrystia Freeland. Is she really about human rights? Is she really about protecting democracy, or is there something else going on here? Another country that's should be is in the news a little bit more than it usually is, and it should be in the news a lot more. That's also important to understanding, kind of getting a sense of Canadian policy towards Venezuela, the hemisphere more generally, is Haiti. In recent days and recent weeks, there have been massive demonstrations, general strikes. Port-au-Prince has been largely shut down for 2 weeks now, and this is just the latest phase of a multi-phase upsurge of protests that goes back to July. A week-long general strike in February that shut down almost all of the urban areas of the country, all calling for the Jovenel Moïse, the president, to go. Moïse is corrupt. His personal company has been found. Has taken a few $1 million of the Petrocaribe Fund, which was the subsidized oil program that Venezuela set up with Haiti. The political party of Moïse is with the previous president, who's found to have stolen over $2 billion in this Petrocaribe Fund. Now, for Haiti, that is an incredibly large sum of money. So the level of corruption is just flagrant, like to the point where just a couple of days ago on the radio, one of the senators just goes on the radio and says, "Yeah, I just received $100,000 to vote in favor of Moïse's candidate as prime minister. Of course, I'm going to take the money. I need the money. We just trade votes in the Senate for $100,000 payments from the president's office. They're not even trying to hide this stuff, which is of course just fueling the anger among those who live on $1 or $2 a day in Port-au-Prince or elsewhere in the country." Moïse is incredibly repressive. They've killed dozens and dozens. It's certainly over 100 at this point, repressing these demonstrations over the last year. This terrible massacre in La Saline, a poor neighborhood in Port-au-Prince last November, where a minimum of 22, I think it's somewhere between 22 and 70 people were killed. This terrible massacre that appears to have been orchestrated from the presidency's, from the presidential palace. And Moïse's legitimacy his electoral legitimacy is very, very weak. Less than 20% of the population voted, all kinds of allegations of ballot stuffing, etc. So the population wants the president gone. The only reason Moïse is in office is because Washington and Ottawa. Simple as that. He's only still there, because of the support of so-called core group, which is really led by Washington and Ottawa. And so Haiti is a country where the overwhelming majority, even the slum and the poor neighborhoods, have been against Moïse since the get-go. Even big sectors of the traditional retrograde Haitian elite have joined in this opposition. So you could, I think, legitimately claim that like 90% of the population wants the president to go. Now, when you contrast that to Venezuela, it's very different in Venezuela. Venezuela is actually quite divided, right? There's like a third of the population, that's 30% of the population that's behind Maduro, maybe kind of equivalent number that's behind the opposition on their maximalist kind of strategy, and another third of the population that's somewhere in the middle that tends to be against the sanctions, tends to be against a possible American invasion. They go in the government's favor of that, but somewhere sort of in the middle. So it's quite a divided side. Haiti is a total opposite. It's divided, and there's different political divisions within it. But within the current political conjuncture, it's just overwhelming opposition to the president. And so, but that presidency survives because Canadian-U.S. support. Canadian support has been financial. Le Devoir yesterday had a story, talked about $700 million. They calculated $700 million in Canadian aid to Haiti since Moise has come to office. Very large amount of money. So kind of surprised me that large. The diplomatic backing, Moise and Trudeau meeting, Canadian ambassador repeatedly statements supportive of the government through the so-called core group of foreign countries that heavily run Haitian affairs. Canada has defended Moise at the level of policing. In Cité Soleil, the big slum neighborhood of Port-au-Prince, they burnt down a police station a couple days ago as part of these protests. Well, that should be viewed as burning down a symbol of Canada. Would never be reported on like that here, but Canada has been right at the forefront of building up the Haitian police since the 2004 coup d'etat against Jean-Baptiste Aristide. And Canada has funded hundreds of millions of dollars of Canadian funding into the Haitian police. Canadian who heads the UN mission that's involved in the training of the Haitian police. This has basically been ongoing for 15 years now. If you go on the Canadian ambassador, now the outgoing Canadian ambassador's Twitter account, there's just tweet after tweet of pictures of him meeting with Haitian police, announcing a new police academy or new police station that Canada has funded, involved with, and whatnot. But what you find almost no tweets, or actually I'd say zero tweets that I'm familiar with, where they talk about the Haitian police killing protesters, where they talk about the human rights violations. So there's all this celebration of Haitian police, there's all this Canadian money going to Haitian police, Canadian police are training the Haitian police, but the rights violations of that force is just, we just stay quiet on that. That has nothing to do with this. So when you contrast, or another example of just of Canadian involvement in Haiti that got basically no attention. In February, when there was the general strike, the Haiti Information Project tweeted out photos of Canadian special forces at the Toussaint Louverture airport in Port-au-Prince. Right? So you see on video these Canadian special forces. I published a story about this. I got in touch with a preeminent military reporter at Post Media to discuss this matter. His assessment that they were Canadian Special Forces, probably 2 JTF2, and the other 2 you can see being the CANSCOM. Can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for. And this is something, so you have Canadian Special Forces deployed to the Port-au-Prince airport. No reporting, no attention about this in Canada. What were they doing? The Haiti Information Project suggested that Moise's family was trying to leave the country amidst this popular revolt, and that they were in some way enabling his family to get out of the country. I don't know one way or another, but it's just a small symbol of how openly Canada will violate Haitian sovereignty, and there's just no discussion about this in our country. And this flows back to the coup of 2004, where the French, Canadians, and Americans overthrew the elected president of Jean-Baptiste Aristide in the middle of the night, February 29th, 2004. U.S. Marines took Aristide. According to Aristide, he was kidnapped and he was literally dumped in the Central African Republic. The night of the coup, Canadian Special Forces were, as reported, were securing the Port-au-Prince airport. And subsequently, there will be 550 Canadian troops on the ground for 6 months. Canada would be involved in every facet of the coup government. There was an individual who'd been living in Florida for 15 years, more than 15 years, Jahel Latatu. They just took him from Florida and said, hey, this is the new head of state in Haiti, and we supported that interim regime for more than 2 years that was responsible for thousands of people being killed. And we supported our military, our police, our aid agency. We paid for the employees of the coup government. They were employees of our aid agency. Literally the second in charge of the Justice Ministry that was responsible for the imprisonment of the constitutional prime minister, the constitutional interior minister, was an employee of the Canadian International Development Agency. The head of the Justice Ministry was an employee of USAID. So we were involved in all facets of this coup. After the earthquake, another issue in Haiti that got some attention. Rarely does Haiti get discussed in our media, but that actually got a fair bit of attention. After the earthquake, we sent 2,000 troops to Haiti. We have the internal government documents, as reported on by the Canadian press, that show that the Canadian government was concerned with the power vacuum after the earthquake, and that they were concerned that Aristide, who was then in exile in South Africa, that he might return home. And so we sent 2,000 troops instead of sending heavy urban search and rescue teams. So the heavy urban search and rescue teams were prepared, based in Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, 6 or 7 across the country, were never sent. Those are designed to deal with medical emergencies, getting people out of rubble. Instead, we sent 2,000 troops, and Americans sent about 15,000 troops. And for a while, Haiti had more troops per square foot and per capita than Iraq, foreign troops than Iraq or Afghanistan. And so our response to this horrible, horrible human calamity, where hundreds of thousands of people died, was to be concerned about, do we have control over Haitian politics? They were concerned that there would be a popular revolt, a popular uprising amidst the earthquake, or after the earthquake. When you look at the Chrystia Freeland's policy, or the Trudeau government's policy in Haiti, and you contrast it with how it's presented in the Globe and Mail, this is clearly an anti-democratic policy. This is clearly an anti-human rights policy in Haiti. While we say we need to get rid of this terrible Maduro government for its democratic deficiencies or human rights violations, Moise's democratic deficiencies are much greater than Maduro's are, and its human rights violations are much greater than Maduro's are. But in the Haiti case, we are the reason why, the sole reason why that government's still in place. So you get to the question of the why, right? What's going on here? Why? What's driving these policies? It's not what we're told in the newspaper, human rights or upholding democracy. And I'm of the opinion, basically, you look at Canadian foreign policy, overwhelmingly it's motivated by two things: support for empire, historically British, today American, and support for Canadian corporate interests abroad. That is overwhelmingly what drives policy. We get told discussions of democracy, human rights, saving the children, whatever, but that's really what's going on. You get into specifics, right? When you look at, take the Haiti and the Honduras example, take the coup of 2004 in Haiti and then Honduras in 2009, both Canadian-backed coups to different degrees. You'll find that there's one major sweatshop company in Montreal, Gallant Activewear, that in both those countries was not happy that the Aristide government increased the minimum wage from about just a shade over $1 to just over $2 a day. They weren't happy with that. And you find a similar dynamic with Manuel Zelaya, who increased the minimum wage, and Gildan, at one point, I think it may still be, was the second biggest employer in Haiti after the Haitian state. Its main subcontractor is, there was just actually a strike at their factory a couple of days ago. Main subcontractor, Ariel, who was the head of the opposition to Aristide before the 2004 coup. He's somebody who looks a lot more like me than he does to most Haitians. He's part of the small elite that run most of the economy, who are mostly white, at least in the Haitian context.
And so you find that there's corporate interests. You find that there's corporate interests in the mining sector that were, again, both hostile to the Aristide government and hostile to the Manuel Zelaya government. I think if you look at the Venezuela policy, and why Canada is so aggressively opposed to the Maduro government and previously to the Chavez government, right now they smell weakness. That's why they're really jumping on Maduro, because they smell the weakness that they didn't smell as much with Chavez. They tried to overthrow Chavez back in 2002, and Canada went along with that. But if you look at trying to understand what's going on with the policy in hostility to Maduro, it's in part, I think, there's particular Canadian corporate interests, banking sector, oil sector, that weren't happy with the Venezuelan government. Petro-Canada was forced to sell one of its operations when there was further nationalization of oil. The biggest, clearest hostility between corporate Canada and the Venezuelan government is in the mining sector, or more precisely the gold sector, where there's a massive battle between Crystal X. And Crystal X got like a $1.5 billion award against Venezuela for its operations, and that's actually used in the business pages, story after story. Crystal X is trying to get the Venezuelan Citgo, American-based, Venezuelan-owned gas company. Other Canadian companies, Vanessa Ventures, Gold Reserves, Resuro Mining, they also had won awards against the Venezuelan government in international tribunal. So there was hostility from sectors of corporate Canada to the socialistic, nationalistic reforms that the Chavez government and the government pursued. I think you have to look at it at a little bit of a broader lens than just the particular corporate interests that were made hostile. I think with regards to Venezuela specifically, also understanding, I think, Honduras and Haiti to a certain extent as well, that in Venezuela particularly, there's Canada is the preeminent mining power in this hemisphere, right? There's $100 billion or so of Canadian mining investment in Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and the moves away from opening up the mineral sector to foreign multinationals in Venezuela, that was not just a concern for the companies that actually had operations in Venezuela, but it was a concern for the Canadian dominance in the mining sector across the hemisphere. And that dominance is very recent, right? In the case of Mexico, they only began allowing foreign mining companies in the mid-90s as part of NAFTA reforms. So there's like 0 Canadian mining companies in Mexico in 1994, and by like 2010, it's like 375. Right? It's like just explosion. So it's basically directly tied to the neoliberal transformations of the past 20, 25 years. And so those are obviously precarious transformations. They can go back in the other direction, of course. And there's many examples of Canadian officials, mining sector officials, corporate Canada officials, stating that this concern about what they call economic nationalism. And one example that kind of goes in that direction, even more like hyperbolic example, was Peter Monk, who was the founder of the biggest Canadian mining company, Barrick Gold. His response to a Financial Times editorial in 2007, a Financial Times editorial that was critical of the Chavez government, but Peter Monk wrote a letter claiming that it wasn't hard line enough against the Chavez government. And so the headline of the letter was "Stop Chavez's demagoguery before it's too late." Your editorial, "Chavez in Control," was way too benign a characterization of a dangerous dictator, the latest of a type who takes over a nation through a democratic process and then perverts or abolishes it it to perpetuate his own power. Aren't we ignoring the lessons of history and forgetting that the dictators Hitler, Mugabe, Pol Pot, and so on became heads of state by a democratic process? So this is the head of the most influential mining executive in Canada, comparing Chavez to Hitler, Pol Pot, etc. And I think that it should be noted that Barrick Gold didn't have any interests in Venezuela. I think it was more that Peter Monk was more sort of class conscious from the mining sector's perspective. Now, the other part to this opposition to the Venezuelan government, and also I think you can see parts of it with regards to Honduras and Haiti. In the case of the Venezuelan government was quite successful in breaking. It's been heavily reversed, but successful in breaking American grip over the region. And they instigated numerous initiatives that helped to weaken U.S. control over the region. And that was obviously very threatening to people in Washington, and I think also should be understood as threatening to the people in Ottawa. So things like UNISUR, where Venezuela played a part in, and then initiatives like the Petrocaribe and the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance. As I mentioned to you, the Venezuelan government had joined that Bolivarian Alliance just before being overthrown. That's clearly one of the things that motivated his overthrow. And we have the internal documents with regards to the Rene Preval government in Haiti. And when they joined Petrocaribe, which is a subsidized oil program that Venezuela set up for a number of countries in the Caribbean, the level of opposition, the pressure the Americans put on Preval to not join this, why wouldn't Haiti want to get cheap oil? Haitian government perspective, like, of course, it's going to take this. But the Americans put all kinds of pressure to try to block that. So there was efforts by the Venezuelan government to break away from the historic and extensive American dominance of the region, and that's in large part what motivated and motivates opposition to the Venezuelan government. So while the book tells us it's about human rights, democracy, in reality it's about particular corporate interests and Canada's support for empire. I'll leave it at that, and we can get into all the different many different other questions that people have. But that helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Salzmann. So I guess I think that works quite well. I mean, I think there's a lot of synthesis. We can synthesize that. There's a theoretical perspective on and a historical perspective on the building of empires. And yeah, so maybe you want to grab a chair and do all questions from the audience. Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I'll attempt a question that ties the two of your presentations together. So I have a question. I'll give you the context of it after. The question is, can or should we view Canada's imperialism as independent to itself, that Canada has its own imperial agency? And the reason I asked that question, and it was actually touched on there towards the end, which is, Canada is one of the most influential mining countries, not just its ability to mine itself, its ability to export its mining technology and expertise to the world. And as a consequence, I wonder to what extent does that motivate Canada independently from the United States? And I'm interested to kind of see if there was a Bernie Sanders government that came in the United States and really changed its foreign policy with regards to how it interacts with capital internationally, would Canada continue to do its own thing? So I think you touched on it a little bit at the end there, but I was kind of curious, like, should we look at that as Canada acting independently imperially, or is Canada just only subservient to American base and capital interests?
Yeah, there's no doubt that when it comes to the mining sector, that Canada is an imperial force in dozens of countries in the world. That the Canadian government, Canadian mining officials have written the mining codes. They represent 80% of the
mining companies in even in like a big country like Mexico, it's some crazy proportion like that, like 80%. They're just involved in all kinds of facets of the mining sector, and that there's no one in Washington saying, "Got to do this." Is some of that capital American capital? For sure. There's no doubt that of the Canadian mining sector that that there's Americans that are invested in Canadian companies. But I think that it's I don't think that's the motivator. Now, so that to me, in the case of the mining sector and other sectors, say that I think that when you brought it out to the bigger picture, there's this debate going on the left with regards to this. Does the Canadian capitalist class just simply see its self-interest in aligning with the U.S. or is it sort of forced into? I kind of take I feel like there's an element that takes two. I don't think the Canadian capitalist class is just independent. I think that's a mistake. There's some elements of people who I broadly agree with the politics. I think they go a little too far. And I'm doing a book right now with the Canadian military. And when you get into the Canadian military, and you look just like how integrated and subservient the Canadian military is to the American military, that's a domain where it's, like that, to me, that argument of just sort of independent Canada, capitalist power, when you look at the military question, it really undermines that argument. But then, the flip side, I'm critical of the left nationalist kind of perspective that says this is just all Americans' force. And any bad thing in Canada was done because of American forces.
Right, yeah, how convenient,
right? And that's not I don't agree with that. But yeah, I mean, the mining example is a clear example. That's Canadian, in my opinion, that's Canadian capital doing it for Canadian capital's perspectives, for Canadian capital's interests, and the Canadian government is heavily involved in that.
Well, I have a question to follow up on that. I mean, what do you think motivated Chrétien not to go to join Iraq campaign? Because I think that was a very signal moment of a sort of split, that was soon overturned. But
the Iraq thing, I mean, there's two parts to that. Yeah. One part that it was because of the mobilization in Montreal, Quebec, right? And there was a real concern that was going to really improve the prospect of the PQ and sovereignty. So there was a mass mobilization. But the reality is, and this is where we get into the military thing I'm talking about, they contributed. I mean, the Canadian government had a legal opinion that Canada was legally at war with Iraq. Because it was in charge of the NATO task force that was patrolling off the coast and stopping Iraqi ships, right? So they had a legal opinion saying Canada was at war with Iraq. The Canadian military, of course, wanted to join the coalition. But what Trudeau didn't do was join the coalition, really. So he didn't give the main thing the Trump administration wanted, which was the political okay for the invasion. But then, the Canadian troops that were part of American units continued. It was the Canadian general that later became head of the military, was in charge of 130,000 troops in Iraq. It was Canadian generals, different points in charge of huge numbers.
So recycled to NATO?
No, through NORAD, for instance, the NORAD operations in Tampa, Florida, that were involved in planning it, and Canadian officials actually go to the Middle East to help plan the invasion and stuff like that through NORAD. So basically the Canadian military is so linked in with the American military. The American military can't go to war without the Canadian military being part of it. Would be how I would frame that. And so Trudeau backed away from the political component, and then continued on with the rest. But yeah, so it's basically the anti-war movement, even though it was these monstrous demonstrations, historic, and then in a history of anti-war stuff. We were powerful enough to win a partial victory, and that's the best we've ever done.
I guess maybe to sort of build on what Sean was saying, and maybe for the sake of clarity, if there were sort of a left movement that was ascending in the U.S. and their foreign policy were to change, how much would Canada's foreign policy then change?
The question is whether, I think the bigger question is whether Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren can function, whether the Wall Street and the fossil fuel industries and the global interests in the United States will let these people function if they get elected. I think that that they would be stymied from the very beginning. I don't know whether you saw Krugman's piece that Paul Krugman wrote. Why does Wall Street hate Elizabeth Warren so much? They'd rather have fascism than have any regulation. And I think it's gotten to that stage. So I think the amount of flexibility there without a popular movement to really sustain any of these people. But there definitely is a symbiotic relationship. I mean, with the oil, oil pricing, and making sure at least the hemispheric oil supplies are, within the control of both Canada and the United States to keep the security, emphasis on tar sands as being part of this, broader mutual defense pact, and probably in the Arctic, which I think is the most likely place that a sort of resource war is going to break out, and the symbiotic relationship between the two countries.
Well, I find the thing, stuff on, like, I don't think Elizabeth Warren wants to change American foreign policy.
No, I don't think she wants to change foreign policy.
Or domestic policy is obviously a lot better than
Yeah.
current election. But Bernie Sanders, actually, there is some change. He does represent, whether it's foreign policy, he has made enough hints in the direction that,
That said, I mean, he still supposed to support bombing Yugoslavia, takes right beyond money.
tons of examples.
There's no pure politician.
No, tons of examples of his, big part of the American empire. But nonetheless, within that context, he does, I think, represent something different than like Hillary Clinton didn't really represent something different, right? And Elizabeth Warren maybe a little bit different than Hillary Clinton, but kind of basically. So, if like something like Haiti, okay, I would say like Haiti today, Bernie Sanders 3 days ago, put out, not a great tweet, but for American politics, a good tweet of like, there's killings going on in Haiti, there's mass protests, we shouldn't be, backing this kind of tweet. And I think that you would find that that the Trudeau government would, if Bernie Sanders' presidency moved away from supporting Moise, Canadian government would follow that, right? Like, the Canadian corporate interests in Haiti are not significant enough to be, and even at this point, they may not even particularly want the president anyways, because that level of corruption is not particularly good for business and that kind of stuff. So I think there are some issues like that where a Bernie Sanders presidency, when you find in Canada, policy got a lot better. But the bigger policy of trying to open up countries' mining sectors, I don't really see why Bernie Sanders' presidency particularly would change that, because that's coming from corporate Canada more than it's coming from.
I wanted to just go back to something that you pointed out early on in your presentation, the role of redistribution as a point of survival in the maintenance of empire. And I've certainly seen that, had that impression with Bernie Sanders, in fact. I mean, the big change that Bernie Sanders offers is that he's making the point that I will fund these things by defunding the military, and that will limit their options moving forward if that were to happen. But the criticism of Bernie Sanders is that he is talking about redistributing the wealth that they have gotten through expansionism and imperialism to the benefit of the Americans without really having any conversation about reconciliation or redistribution at an international level. So I find that interesting, and I wonder, I've heard some things on the campaign trail from the NDP that have kind of raised question marks, like, for example, there was this whole conversation about the Saudi arms sales, and kind of the NDP's like easy out for that, because they don't want to kind of offend those workers in that area, is to say, well, we'll just use those tanks here, I guess.
On what?
On what and for what reason? But that kind of goes back to this idea of the role of redistribution as a point of survival of empire, because Bernie Sanders is certainly not running on I'm going to dismantle the American empire. He's running on I'm going to run it more justly, which is a conversation. If that's the furthest we can go with the conversation absent a mass movement. I guess that's what we can hope for.
Yeah, I just think that we're at a point where it's such a maximalist idea. I think that the area for concessions in this corporate elite, they've gotten so much since 1989 with so little impediment. And I do think that they're the tail. They're no longer they're what's driving politics all the way through, right? I mean, Trudeau capitulating to tar sands, and making this a point of economic nationalism, especially, and Trump doing the same thing, that they found this sort of populist vein that they're going to mine, and how much military-industrial complex is so enormous in the United States. It's so enormous, and it's so multifaceted, and with the privatization of the American military, there's so many aspects of the military that are just grafted on to that. Added to the fact that what people don't realize, and it really hit me forcefully, when a friend of mine has been dragged, her program, she opened the first Arab American Studies program at San Francisco State, and she's just been attacked, savage, because she's Palestinian and progressive. But the main source of the funding for the people who are attacking her, and they just have endless pockets, is Silicon Valley. And so we forget there's this merger also in the military-industrial complex with the high-tech sector. And they're in bed with one another. So the amount of give there on any level, whether it's domestic or international, I see is getting less and less and less. I mean, it just has to be a totally different way to approach it, because Bernie, will be compromised. It'd be a little bit better. I completely agree on international policy. And Warren, zero, and she really starts out as a conservative. But I just think the area of negotiation, cutting back any of the privileges that the corporate sector has gotten is so narrow. And perhaps the Canadian mining sector just is emerging from that symbiotic relationship. It started with NAFTA as a redistributive mechanism within the empire, right? And gave the Canadian elites a head start, and now they have a say.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's no doubt that the Canadian mining sector has been just an incredible beneficiary of neoliberalism across the globe. And if you look at Canadian funding of International Monetary Fund and structural adjustment programs going back to the 1980s, many different African countries would find the connection between Canadian mining companies getting in there, and that process is quite tight. So the NAFTA, the reorientation of the economy towards neoliberalism or Keynesian or whatever has been incredibly beneficial to Canadian capital. They're committed to that.
So after reading a couple of your books, when Mark Erickson came to the door, for votes recently.
Mark Erickson is
The
little
candidate.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Landlord.
Okay, right. Anyway, so I started, because I traveled, first of all, with Rights Action to Guatemala to see all the human rights, the horrendous things happening with our mining companies there, throwing people off their land. And I also said, why can't Canada make more independent decisions, around, why did we join, with the U.S. around Haiti and Honduras, and why do we have to continue in this way? Why can't we be more independent? He said, totally because of economics. Our economic tie to the U.S. is too strong to change any of that. So it was just really discouraging, I guess. So then who do we vote for? I mean, the thing is, I think I'll be voting for sure for the Green Party, but if we don't get enough people voting for them, then what chance of anything changing in our government and their actions?
I mean, my last book is about how the NDP and the labor movement and others on the left have been part of imperialism, right? So, I don't think that
chance of a Jagmeet Singh government is very slim. I think it would be better than a Justin Trudeau government on a number of domestic issues.
Right.
And it may be slightly better on international issues, but the thrust of the policy is going to stay the same. Even when they're in opposition, we take Venezuela, right? And then Navarrete, the NDP foreign critic, her policy with regards to the Juan Guaido recognition was like, we should basically going to follow the Europeans who said we can give the Maduro government 10 days or 2 weeks to have a new election, which everyone knew was like no chance it was going to happen, and then we're going to recognize him. So we don't want to just do exactly like the Americans and Canada are doing, and that was Navarrete's position. So like she basically, she accepts 98% of Canadian position vis-a-vis Venezuela. There's some other issues where they're slightly better, something like the mining, right? Like crazy Trudeau government promised to bring in, proper ombudsperson with regards to mining. They failed even that. That's like, to me, that was one that I would expect they would have done. They failed that. Now the NDP probably would have, a Jagmeet Singh government probably would have adopted that. I'm not even sure that I said that about a Trudeau government 4 or 5 years ago, right? So we can't look at this as like, okay, well, let's vote. I mean, I think people should vote, and less bad is less bad, and depending on your context, like if it's I wrote a recent piece that went into that. Like I'm the person vote NDP because my riding is a NDP Liberal battle, and I prefer the NDP. Anything against a good candidate too, good candidate. But it's just one piece of much broader politics, right? And if your riding is like a surefire Liberal seat, maybe if there's a Communist Party candidate, better off voting that way or something further to the left, right? That would be the vote's just a small strategic piece of a much broader political thing. We need to change the political culture. How do we do that? There's no easy answer to that, right? It's about building, Haiti solidarity groups, mining and justice solidarity groups, rights action is a good example. Building, those social movement groups that there's not some big funding agency willing to fund. The media doesn't tend to want to, quote them, and so tends to marginalize them. So, but that's the solution in my mind. It's not an easy solution.
So is that why youth in the past haven't voted, because they didn't feel it was worth it? That they weren't, they weren't seeing any positive change likely to happen with any of the parties. And I wonder if that will happen again. Although I think they're they're so active now.
I think you have to ask why they're active now. I think they finally see the stakes. It's like every semester I used to teach this big world history course and walk in and explain to the students that I apologize that you have to have a class of 120 students. This shouldn't be, You should, in your first years of college, you should have little seminars. Why is that so? You need more information than ever before to vote responsibly, understand the world. And that will give you much less, what's going on here. And I said, well, and you complain about tuition, but you don't vote. In fact, Kingston almost lost this district, and it was a student district. They were trying to take it away. It was gerrymandering, here in Kingston, because they said, well, the students don't vote anyway. You just might as well amalgamate them with a more conservative writing, So, so try to get that message across, but the environment has gotten the message across, and I don't think it's actually the students I've been teaching, it's high school students who have, really, so I think that's something that really is a point, perhaps, my great disappointment as an immigrant to Canada, I've been here 14 years, is how the Canadian government has basically wedded the future of Canada to the most regressive and destructive industries, right? So mining on one side, well, all extractive, mining and tar sands. And there's no future, So, why aren't we communicating that to people? That you're destroying their future, destroying your kids' future, and we have to start this transition. So, I think the Green New Deal issue is something that one can pick up on both sides of the border and have many impacts in terms of labor, discussions with labor, youth, and of course foreign policy. So that's my thanks.
Yeah. I was gonna say the topic of the discussion was like Canadian imperialism and climate change. There is of course emphasis, like on the profit driven, like motives of the big mining companies, extractive industries, their operation overseas, and the political coalitions they support, and of course political resistance that they want to crash. That's there, but also we are talking in a time, I think, where there's this kind of optimism in the air because of the activism or scale of activism that we are witnessing. Like maybe Canadians' decision when the Iraqi invasion was happening, if it was influenced partly by the anti-war movement, I think there is a chance that this new radical movement growing might have an impact. But of course, for this movement to have an impact, the movement needs to have weapons of right ideas, maybe a broader perspective, and consistent struggle, like along with that. But definitely, like in Toronto, like how many people I don't remember, but it was hundreds of thousands in Montreal, in Vancouver. It was crowded. Even at Queens, it is said that in the history of campus activism, it was the biggest, largest, and the people were chanting slogans like system change, not climate. So the radical tone in the protests was there. So when we are discussing this, I think this anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism as two shared political projects for us, they should be on the table, and we should be looking at the mass anger, which gives us opportunities for alliances, I think. So, and in that front, we might not be doing so well. I come from a different country, and we have different problems, but in Canada, as far as I can observe, there should be a greater alliance between this young radical activism and the labor and the political activists who try to contribute to labor movement and environment movement. So we need a greater dialogue, and so seeing imperialism not something as functioning overseas, but something happening, like in the very locale, place and time, right? And this is optimism for me. Why? It kind of gives me a little bit hope. Why? Because when we are discussing Venezuela, we are also discussing a period when this pink tide, kind of a revolutionary or radical transformationary period is retreating, right? With Chavez maybe being the epitome of that wave, not only in Venezuela, but in many other countries in the region, is now on the retreat. So now this is the chance for us, those on the left spectrum, those who want to make a change to the positive. So we are witnessing something new, not totally that we built, but we find ourselves within it, and it's really inspiring, right? So to how to change the tide of right wing, of the let's say kind of nationalistic, populist, like politics, which is very reactionary in a globally more tense, geopolitics, global politics. So we should maybe invest our energies in talking to those new generation and building something radical out of that.
I think we need mutual education.
Yeah.
And I would add another component, which again I saw lacking in 2015 at the sort of alternative conference with, activist groups that were meeting in Paris. And that was a recognition that they had a vested interest in promoting the Pope's encyclical, which is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and pro-environment, and anti-speciesist. Maybe we're not Catholics, but we should be, trying to work within the church systems. They've got an infrastructure there that can be worked through, and they should be promoting that encyclical, and they're not. And maybe there should be some kind of protest around why these North American bishops are not moving. I mean, it's an agenda, it's spelled out. I mean, the encyclical is amazing. And there are other churches, the Ecumenical Patriarch has also organized a big environmental conference. Naomi Klein was at 2 years ago. The Serbian, the Eastern Orthodox churches have sort of jumped on the environment wagon, and they're offering their flock, and in a way offering their infrastructure for this merging of interest groups who want to radically transform politics and the economics of the planet. So, and there are Muslim leaders who've mobilized too, but it's not a centralized church like Catholicism.
A lot of the spaces I've been organizing in, there's usually a Quaker or two on the scene as well. So, I mean, there's definitely room there for building alliances, and it's best that we build those bridges rather than trying to work individually in our silos.
Yeah, I know, and they have infrastructure.
Exactly.
They have churches, they have
Donations.
parishioners and donations, and some of them have outreach to Central America, progressive outreach, so, Rios Montt type of right-wing Christians.
I just want to maybe add one touching point to kind of connect it all together to the current election. It's something I really think is troubling for Canada's politics as far as what's possible on the left is with the Green Party, with the NDP, with the Liberals, obviously, the Conservatives. We stop what's possible at our borders, and we forget that Canada's part of this massive imperial and capitalist engine. So when we talk about, we look at the Green Party's policies as to what they're going to do, and they're very aggressive domestically. We look at the NDP, arguably they're offering something that's maybe more aggressive because it ties in more labor policies, but it's still domestic. And where is the party policies putting forward to say we are going to stop and disallow Canadian companies from exploiting the environment and labor in other places in the world because it is so disproportionate to our size. For a country of our size, it's so disproportionate how much abuse we wrought outside of our borders. And I mean, Jesus, we could do more for the environment if we maybe rein that in, but it's all tied to this capital. And so for a political party to suggest that they're going to do that is such a huge uphill battle. It's very difficult even just to get it talked about. If you do any internal politics, if you do inside parties, you go to conventions where these policies get put forward, it's such a huge thing because people will shout you down and be like, that's ridiculous, that's too radical, that's not possible, why are you bringing that up? We're talking about Canada. And it limits what we can do to build a mass movement. So I think things like Kingston Peace Council, we're a small group here today, but there's a lot of these small groups. I didn't even know the one that you were talking about, never heard of it before, but I'm sure it's great. And I hope we can start to stitch ourselves together and talk about Canada's complicity in all this and stop kind of pretending like, Canada is just getting pulled along by American capital and American imperialism. We're totally capable of this violence ourselves, and we need to address that as part of addressing climate change and our own domestic issues.
If there's no more questions, I think that's almost a perfect cap on everything and a good place to leave it. So I'd like to thank one more time Dr. Salzmann for joining us today. Both very enlightening conversations, and I think really sort of tied everything together with the discussion that we had. So thanks everyone for showing up.
Thank you for the concept.
If anyone's interested, probably go grab a beer at the grad club, but that is not mandatory.
I should say